All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're going to put on our historical detective hats and piece together the dramatic rise and the absolutely devastating fall of the very first great human civilization. I'm talking about Sumer. I want you to just imagine standing under the baking Iraqi sun right now. You're staring out at these massive mounds of brick, surrounded by absolutely nothing but a few dry shrubs. And you might be asking yourself the exact same thing those early explorers did. How on earth did a bustling, thriving metropolis ever exist in the middle of a barren desert? Well, to figure that out, we have to start piecing together the clues left behind in the sand. And our very first major clue comes from an Italian explorer named Pietro della Valle way back in 1625. He was wandering around the ruins of the ancient city of Ur, and he literally stumbled upon something incredible. He wrote in his journal about finding pieces of black marble engraved with the same weird letters he saw on the bricks, which he thought looked like some kind of seal. What he was actually holding were baked clay tablets containing a completely dead, forgotten language. Without even realizing it, this guy held the keys to understanding a society that basically invented the modern world. But, before we talk about how they built these incredible cities, we really need to look at how they got there in the first place. And a massive clue lies in the post-glacial climate. So around 10,000 BC, the last ice age ends. By 7,500 BC, all those melting glaciers trigger a rapid sea level rise. We're not talking about a gentle, gradual shift here. This was a violent, terrifying encroachment of the ocean. It is highly, highly likely that this massive climate shift actually forced nomadic tribes completely out of their flooded coastal valleys, pushing them into dense new settlements along the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. And this actually points to something super fascinating. It's highly probable that this devastating, real-world environmental event is exactly what inspired the epic Sumerian flood myths, like the story of Ziusudra or the famous Epic of Gilgamesh. These weren't just campfire stories. They were actual ancient survival accounts, basically giving us a factual basis for the myths of a great flood that drove human migration and ultimately shaped their entire worldview. This whole forced migration theory also helps explain our next huge archaeological mystery. The Sumerians spoke what linguists call a language isolate. That basically means their language had absolutely no known linguistic relatives. Nothing. It was completely unique to them, with zero connection to the Semitic languages spoken by literally all of their neighbors. So, as investigative historians, this really makes us wonder, were the Sumerians actually a population of refugees from those flooded coastal lands arriving in Mesopotamia with an already fully formed, distinct culture? Now, when they finally arrived in this new land, they ran into a massive problem. Normally, to build a civilization, you need abundant wood, strong stone, and accessible metals. Well, the Sumerians had none of that. Zero. Their new environment essentially offered them three things: marsh reeds, river mud, and baking clay. So here's the crucial takeaway. This sheer lack of natural resources essentially forced them to become incredibly innovative. They literally had to build an empire out of mud and weeds. So how do you actually build a marshland metropolis without any stone or wood? Well, you use the reeds. First, they'd harvest these thick, towering marsh reeds. Then, they figured out how to bind them together into massive, incredibly strong structural beams. And finally, they'd coat the whole thing in river mud and bitumen just to waterproof it. It's wild to think about, but they engineered these incredible vaulted houses and massive temples right on top of swampy, unstable ground, simply by bundling marsh reeds. And because they were packed together in these tightly knit, vaulted reed neighborhoods, their daily life became extremely communal. It basically sparked early forms of intense, localized social organization just so they could survive. But, of course, they couldn't just stop at building homes. To survive that blistering heat and those really unpredictable spring floods, they had to tame the twin rivers themselves. So they dug out these incredibly complex canal irrigation networks, they built dams to control the violent floodwaters, they even cultivated tall date palms specifically to provide shade for the more fragile crops growing underneath them. Thanks to this brilliant early urban planning, they started harvesting massive surpluses of barley, wheat, and sesame. They literally turned dusty salt flats into a green, thriving patchwork that could actually sustain stable, dense populations. And here is where things get really exciting. It's this exact food surplus that sparked an absolute technological explosion. Think about it. When you aren't spending every single waking moment just looking for your next meal, you actually have time to invent things. And the Sumerians gave the world a rapid-fire series of game-changing innovations. They used local clay to fuel the fast potter's wheel. They invented the heavy agricultural plow, which completely revolutionized their farming output and food security. And mastering copper fabrication and the wheel, that totally radicalized their military capabilities and trade structure. They fundamentally changed how humans lived, fought, and connected with each other. But, perhaps their absolute greatest clay-based innovation was writing. What started out as just basic pictographs, simple drawings to count sheep and grain, eventually evolved into cuneiform. These early scribes took those basic pictures and transformed them into a highly functional, complex writing system by pressing wedge-shaped reeds into wet clay tablets. This was basically the ultimate ancient data storage. With no wood or paper around, standardized clay tablets fueled their entire society's record-keeping. And honestly, it's kind of funny, some of the oldest translated cuneiform tablets we have aren't some profound poetry. They're mundane tax receipts, daily beer rations, and literally ancient customer service complaints. These standardized clay tablets were essentially the engines of their entire economy. Having reliable record-keeping enabled them to set up complex taxation systems. Meanwhile, the invention of the cylinder seal was a huge breakthrough. It allowed merchants to officially identify and secure their trade goods. Combine that with the wheel, hook it up to some transportation cards, and suddenly they could physically move these goods like never before. Putting all these simple tools together allowed the Sumerians to organize massive, long-distance trade networks, tracking standardized goods across the ancient world. Now, to manage all this complex long-distance trade and early government taxation, they obviously needed math. And this brings us to a number you are very, very familiar with, 60. This massive number is the anchor of their brilliant sexagesimal counting system. The way it worked is they actually counted on the joints of their fingers. You have 4 fingers with 3 joints each, that makes 12. Multiply that by the 5 fingers on your other hand, and boom, you get 60. This base 60 system they invented is the exact reason why our modern hour is divided into 60 minutes, and why our circles have 360 degrees today. How crazy is that? And they didn't just organize the Earth either, they organized the sky. By carefully charting the heavens, they mapped out early constellations, identified the 5 visible planets, and meticulously tracked the lunar cycle. This massive collection of data allowed them to develop a highly accurate 2-season agricultural calendar. Their stellar mapping directly guided their farming seasons and their religious rituals. They literally tied their daily survival to the movement of the stars. Over time, as the population doomed and these early city-states started fiercely competing for resources and water rights, we see a major shift. The society transitioned from these early agricultural settlements into urbanized pioneers, and with that, divinely selected kings started replacing the early priest-judges. You see, the creation of standardized tax records, plus the growing need to manage those complex canal networks and fund standing armies, completely transformed their social hierarchy. It centralized their governance right under the power of a single monarch. To give you a sense of what that looked like, just look at the incredible scale of mass production under these new central governments. In a single city, like Girsu, they employed 15,000 workers in the textile industry alone. Add to that 10,000 grain administrators and 8,000 canal diggers. This massive, tightly controlled, specialized labor force was sustained entirely by their incredibly organized farming and irrigation networks. So, as our historical investigation nears its end, we really have to ask the ultimate question here. How does an invincible, technologically advanced empire simply collapse into the sand? What actually happened to the brilliant creators of the wheel and written language? Well, we have to piece together the final clues of their rapid and devastating disappearance. The tragedy of Sumer can basically be mapped out like a deadly domino effect. It all started with overfarming and excessive canal irrigation. Over time, that excessive watering led to salinization, which left a highly toxic white crust of salt right on the topsoil. With the soil completely poisoned, widespread famine and starvation severely weakened the cities. And finally, with the population decimated and vulnerable, Amorite and Elamite armies invaded. It is a massive tragic irony. The very irrigation canals that built their civilization were exactly what slowly poisoned it. Let's look a little closer at this white crust of death for a second. As the Tigris and Euphrates rivers repeatedly flooded those heavily farmed plains, the water would just sit there and eventually evaporate under the hot Iraqi sun,
leaving behind trace minerals. Over centuries, those minerals accumulated into a thick, crumbly, white salt crust. It absolutely choked their barley crops. Their brilliant technological mastery of the environment eventually pushed that very same environment right past its breaking point.
So, with the population literally starving and their armies completely demoralized, the end was incredibly brutal. Nomadic tribes and rival empires completely shattered their weakened defenses. The Guti mountain tribes came in and burned the city of Akkad. The massive 300-kilometer Martu wall, which was built specifically to keep invaders out, completely failed. Amorite nomads overran whatever was left of the starving farmlands, and finally, Elamite forces sacked the great capital city of burning its magnificent ziggurats to the ground. And the crazy thing is, we actually have a first-hand account of this collapse. There's a haunting translation from a clay tablet known as the Lamentation over and it perfectly captures the despair. It reads, "The people mourn, its people like broken potsherds, littering the approaches. In all the streets and roadways, bodies lay." Millions of Sumerian refugees were forced to flee north, completely abandoning their dead cities. And as they assimilated into other cultures, they lost their unique language forever, leaving it behind as this incredible, lasting archaeological mystery. It's a heavy story, but it brilliantly illustrates the cycle of history. And it leaves us with a truly provocative thought to end this explainer on. If the very first great human civilization engineered its own environmental collapse simply through the overexploitation of its resources, are we building our own modern empires on equally unstable ground? As we master our own environment with incredible technology today, are we leaving behind a sustainable future? Or just another set of mysterious ruins in the sand?